Hello everyone, we're picking our study back up in Acts 23. Where we left off in Acts 22, Paul was about to be heard by the Sanhedrin. Our study tonight will give us a little better idea of who the Sanhedrin is, also give us some insight into some people we read about in other parts of the Bible, such as the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And we'll see the will of God revealed to Paul and being played out in Paul's life as Paul will ultimately expand his witness from the Jews to the Romans. And we'll see where the Lord is leading Paul in his ministry. So let's jump right in and see what we can learn. As Paul is meeting with the Sanhedrin, with Ananias, the high priest, presiding over, he begins to speak. He looks earnestly at them and he says, "Men and brethren, I've lived in all good conscience before God until this day." He begins with a statement of his holiness. He has obeyed God as best he understood. And I think he applies this also to the time he spent as a persecutor of the church. He genuinely believed that was the will of God, the plan of God. And he carried it out, even to the point of horrible things he did to the saints. He believed he was right with God. He met Jesus, who changed his heart, but all along he can honestly say that he's been obedient to God throughout every step of his life. That's how he opens his statement to the Sanhedrin, or as we see them here, to the council. And the response they have to this initial statement that before God, I can honestly say I've obeyed him, the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. The initial response to his statement of holiness is to get punched in the face. Ananias orders him. Ananias isn't man enough to do it himself, but he orders him, and so he's punched in the mouth. Paul speaks up and he says, "God will strike you. You whitewashed wall." Now, what a strange insult is that? What he means here is that everything holy about you is on the outside. You're holy because you're the priest. You're holy because you're wearing the robe. You're holy because you have the office and because you think you keep the law, but you're just painted over. On the inside, you're not changed at all. And in our own homes, it's remarkable what you can do with a coat of new paint and how it can make everything appear to be brand new, but whatever you paint over is still whatever it was before you painted it. And he says, "That's what you are, Ananias. You're just painted over." And he says, "You sit to judge me according to the law." Here you are, the judge whose job it is to uphold the law and make sure we keep the law, and you command me to be struck against the law. The law doesn't allow abuse like this. And he says, "You're a lawbreaker, even as you sit to judge me to see whether I've broken the law." So Paul is not afraid to speak up here for himself. He begins with a statement of his own holiness as best he could understand it. And then he speaks up and he says, "God's going to judge you because you think your job is to make sure I keep the law, but you break the law yourself." Now, after that, something interesting happens. The ones who stood by said, "Do you revile God's high priest? How dare you speak against Ananias?" Well, Ananias just had him punched in the face, so you can understand why Paul would have some animosity here. "Do you revile God's high priest?" They think this man can do no wrong. They think he's infallible. They can watch him order the abuse of a prisoner who's already been beaten and question why the prisoner would revile him when he points out that it's against the law to have him beaten. There's this obedience to the high priest because of who he is, because of the office that he holds, that requires that they suspend their judgment. They can't see what he does as wrong because of the position he's in. Whatever he does must necessarily be right. And sometimes you see this with leaders in politics. Sometimes you see it with leaders in religion. Sometimes you see it with pastors, where we tend to hold them up so highly that we can't see when their behavior is wrong. And we should be very careful about that, because there's not a person among us who's not accountable to the Word of God. Then Paul responds here, and it's hard to read emotion into a response like this. All we have is the words written. We don't have how they were spoken. But I think this is probably a sarcastic response. He said, I did not know, my brethren, that he was the high priest. Now, Ananias is the high priest of Judaism, and Paul is a Pharisee of the Pharisees and probably a member of the Sanhedrin. And Paul was sent with orders from the high priests, from the religious authority, to persecute the church. I think Paul knew exactly who Ananias is. He was well known. He wasn't a secret. He said, I had no idea he was the high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. I had no idea that a high priest would order a prisoner to be beaten. That's what's implied here, I think. I think Paul knew who he was. I think his answer is sarcastic, and its point is to point out that Ananias is a lawbreaker, even as he's upholding the law in this Sanhedrin. I would never speak ill of the high priest. I had no idea, based on his behavior, that he was high priest. I think that's what Paul means here. I think he knew who he was, but he uses this moment as an opportunity to point out Ananias's evil behavior. So Paul sizes up the room. He reads the room, and he makes his statement to the Sanhedrin as a whole based on who's in it. When Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other were Pharisees, he shouted out, men and brethren, I'm a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. I've been a Pharisee for a long time, and my daddy before me. Concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am being judged. So he pits the room against each other. The Pharisees, as we're going to see explained in a moment, believe very strongly in the resurrection. They believe in angels and spirits as well. The Sadducees were a more secular organization within Judaism, and they believe there's not a resurrection of the dead, that when you die, that's it. You'll remember that they were the ones who posed the riddle to Jesus about a man who died, and his wife went to his brother, and he married her, and then he died, and so on through the 7 brothers, and they died, and then they ask in the end, in the resurrection, whose wife is she? And that was a puzzle they would use to poke fun at the idea that there is a resurrection, that if we're all alive again, these brothers are going to be fighting over this wife. So they don't believe in the resurrection. The Pharisees do believe in the resurrection at the final day. And so he says, concerning the hope of the resurrection, I'm being judged, which is completely true, because his gospel is the resurrection of Christ, and eventually the resurrection of the saints, and even the resurrection of the lost for eternal judgment. The core of it all is the resurrection. So he takes this key doctrine to the gospel, which was also key to the Pharisees, and he says, this is the real issue here. And he pits them against each other. And when he had said this, an argument arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. And then we have this explanation from Luke. For the Sadducees say there is no resurrection, and no angel or spirit. The only spiritual being is God. Everything else is simply material. It's just physical, which is why there's not a resurrection, because once you die, there's nothing left of you to be raised up again. But we believe the resurrection can happen because there's spirit that lives on. They did not believe that at all. And he says, but the Pharisees confess both. Then there arose a loud outcry. They start shouting at each other. And the scribes of the Pharisees arose and protested, saying, "We find no evil in this man. He hasn't done anything wrong. He's one of us. He believes in the resurrection." They haven't even heard specific charges against him. He says, "I'm here because I believe in the resurrection," and they say that's good enough for us. But if a spirit or angel has spoken to him, because the witness Paul had, he hasn't brought it out here yet in this meeting, was that he saw the appearance of Christ, that some supernatural being appeared to him and told him something, and the Pharisees have no problem believing that could happen because they believe there are supernatural beings, angels and spirits. They don't see the resurrected Jesus, but they believe there are spirits who could appear and speak. That the Sadducees say those beings don't exist, and so they say we find no evil in him. But if an angel or spirit has spoken to him, let us not fight against God. This man might be on God's side. The Lord might have actually spoken to him. We believe that could happen. So let's not oppose God in all of this. The argument they're having over what they believe is so deep and so heated and so profound that there's so much of an argument that the command, fearing that Paul might be pulled to pieces by them. These are the austere religious leaders of the Jews. They're mostly old men, and they're scholars and they're priests and they're rabbis, and the argument becomes so vehement that he fears that Paul would be harmed by violence even in the middle of it. I've never been in a meeting where I actually thought somebody was going to get hurt, but that's what this officer thought here. So he made the soldiers enter the meeting, and they got Paul and they brought him out by force from among them and brought him into the barracks, where he would either be scourged or where he would be protected. But he is in possession of the Romans right now, so that the Sanhedrin wouldn't harm him. Paul has pit them against each other. He's gotten right to the core of the issue, and they oppose each other so much that even his life was at risk. So the question arises, where is God in all of this? If the religious scholars are having people beaten and they're fighting and arguing to the point where Paul might be harmed if he continues to stay there, when we see people behaving so badly, where is God in all of this? God is right in the middle of it, and God is at work. So the following evening, the Lord stood by him. Paul here standing up for the Lord standing by him. And he appears to him, and he says, "Be of good cheer, Paul." Good news, Paul. Now, Paul is a prisoner of the Romans for his own protection because his own people are planning to kill him. And have attempted to do so. And we're going to see in a moment they're going to attempt to kill him again. Good news, Paul, cheer up, for as you've testified of Jerusalem, so you must also bear witness at Rome. I've got bigger things for you to do even than this, Paul. As difficult as it was, the good news is he gets to do more of it at a higher level. That his witness would expand even into the Roman prior. He'll appeal to Caesar, that he could bear witness, and this is very difficult for Paul to do. He would rather just be at church. He would rather be preaching. He'd rather be teaching. But the ministry God has appointed for him right now is to bear witness, and he's going to get to do that all the way up to Caesar. In response to all of these things, there's an alliance that arises among some Jews. It says that when it was day, some of the Jews banded together and bound themselves under an oath, saying that they would neither eat nor drink until they'd killed Paul. Now, they made this oath with fasting. So it was like an oath unto God even. Look at the religious fanaticism here. That they're going to kill Paul because they don't agree with him on the gospel that he preaches and the relationship that it bears to the law. How many of them? 40 who had formed this conspiracy. So it's a large number of men. If you wanted to move them around in our world, you'd have to put them on a school bus. I mean, it was a lot of guys. It's a small army. So they went to the chief priests and the elders and said, "We've bound ourselves under an oath." What sort of an oath? Great oath. We will not eat anything until we've killed Paul. We have sworn unto God that we are going to kill Paul. Now, therefore, you, together with the Sanhedrin, suggest to the commander that he be brought down to you tomorrow, as though you were going to make further inquiries about him. Okay, we've all calmed down. We'd like to talk to Paul again. It'll be much more peaceful this time. Could you send him back to us again? But we're ready to kill Paul before he gets close. So they're going to wait, and the assumption is that Paul would be brought by maybe one Roman or two, and they would overpower them, and they would assassinate Paul on the way to the Sanhedrin. All the elders obviously have an alibi. They're sitting in at the council awaiting Paul's arrival because they're good, they're devout, holy men, and they just want to get to the truth. And so they come out of this spotless, and these other men presumably will just scatter, and Paul will have been killed. So that's the plan. Now, put yourself into the position of one of these religious leaders. Your job is to keep the law. Your job is for Israel to be pure. You are the spokesman of God to the people of God who bear a unique relationship to God. And you're being asked to murder someone in the name of God. How would you respond to that? Well, their response is to go along with that. They didn't put a stop to this scheme at all. They're going to do it. But the Lord is at work here, and He's put somebody in a unique position to hear about it. When Paul's sister's son, his nephew, heard of their ambush, we don't know who he is. We don't know how he found out about it. We don't know his relationship to the Sanhedrin, but somehow he knows. He found out about it. He went to the barracks and he told Paul. So Paul brought over centurions, and we're going to see these guys again in a minute. What this is a captain over 100 men. That's why they're sent. That's for 100. So he brings over a pretty high-ranking officer, and he said, "Will you take this young man to the commander, for he has something to tell him?" So he brought him, and he said that Paul, the prisoner, asked me to bring this young man to you. He has something to say to you. So Paul is able to arrange a meeting between the officer over all of this and his nephew, who has information about the ambush. The commander brought him by the hand, went aside, and asked privately, "What is it that you have to tell me?" Now this says a lot about the commander's appraisal of what's going on. He realizes there's something not right, and so he's willing to meet away from everybody else in private with this young man and to hear what's going on. And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask." The Sanhedrin is in on this. Their hands are right in the middle of it. That you bring Paul to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire more about him. Don't yield to them, for 40 of them lie in wait for him, men who have bound themselves by an oath that they won't eat or drink until they've killed him. And now they're ready, waiting for the promise from you. The ambush is already set. If you send Paul out, they're going to assassinate him, and they're going to attack your men. The Sanhedrin is in on it. Here's the plot. And so he relates it all to this officer, who allows him to leave and says, "Don't tell anybody that you told me this. Just I'll deal with it, but keep it between us." And the way he handles it is with a show of military power. Then he called for the 2 centurions and said, "Prepare 200 men." Now, each of them are over 100 men, plus 70 horsemen, plus 200 more spearmen. So they've got their soldiers under the command of these 2 officers, plus they've got the cavalry, plus they've got the rank and file spearmen who were armed men but not as elite as the Roman soldiers were. So they've got 470 men and 70 horses. They've got a small army, big enough to repel any attack. And he says, "I want you to take him to Caesarea," and this is Caesarea by the sea, and we'll explain some more about where that is and what that is in a moment. "At the 3rd hour of the night." I want you to take him out by night with almost 500 men. Bring mounts to set Paul on. Okay, we're going to take him on a horse so that he can be moved quickly, and bring him safely to Felix, the governor. So the way the Roman Empire was set up, there was the Caesar above it all, and then the areas were broken into kingdoms, which would be ruled by somebody like Herod, and then regionally there would be governors, men like Felix, and then under them would be the leaders of local areas like Pontius Pilate. So everybody has somebody to report to, and everybody is held accountable by somebody else except Caesar. So bring him directly to the governor of the region, to Felix. And so that's what they're going to set out to do. Here in the biblical account, we've got the letter written by this officer to Felix. And this shows us how they talk to each other. It shows us what he thinks of what the real issue is. So here's how he explains it. He says, "This man was seized by the Jews and about to be killed." Okay, they were going to kill him right on the spot. "I rescued him with the soldiers, having learned that he was a Roman." Now that's not quite true. He found that out after he rescued him, but okay. Everybody, when they write to their seniors, set themselves up to look good, I'm sure. "And when I wanted to know the reason they accused him, I brought him before their council." That is, that this is a Jewish issue. "And I found out that he was accused about questions of their law." This is a purely religious issue, but had not done anything that is deserving of imprisonment or death. He's not a criminal against the Roman Empire. They just don't agree with him. "Then I found out they lay in wait for the man. They were going to ambush and kill him. So there's something more going on. So I sent him immediately to you, and also commanded his accusers to state before you the charges against them." So he's going to elevate it. He's going to send it up to Felix, and he's going to require the Sanhedrin to send people to Felix, so that they are held accountable. So that if Paul has violated the laws of Rome, he's accountable to Caesar. But if not, then they have to explain to Felix why they set a snare for his life, why they wanted to kill him. And so he sends the letter, and Paul, so the soldiers, as they were commanded, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. They're not going to do it all in one night. Overnight, they move to a different spot, and then the next day, they left the horsemen to go on with Paul, and they returned to the barracks. So, where the risk of ambush was, they have this huge army who goes out. But now when he's farther out, it's Paul on a horse with 70 horsemen, and the others come back home. When they arrived at Caesarea, this is Caesarea by the sea. It's in Israel. It's on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, and the remains of Herod's praetorium are still there. I've been there. I've stood in the room where Paul probably eventually would make his speech to Felix. Um, they had the the palace there that Herod would visit sometimes. Sat in his bathtub. I don't think I was supposed to, but I did. And then also along the beach, they had a place for horses to race, and they called it the Hippodrome. And you saw the ocean out on one side of this palace, the beach on the other, and then around that and behind it was this city of Caesarea, which was named in honor of Caesar. Um, and this was where Felix was holding court. Um, so when the governor had read it, he asked what province he was from, and when he understood that he was from Cilicia, that is under his authority, he said, "I will hear you when your accusers have come. We will have your day when they show up." And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's praetorium. Um, this wasn't, properly speaking, a prison, although Paul was a prisoner, but it would have been in the barracks with the army, and he would have been under their guard. And here ends Acts 23. And so we've seen the movement of God here moving Paul along. We haven't seen a lot of profound statements about who God is, but we've seen how God is at work. And we've seen that the road that he has established for Paul to walk down is very difficult. But as he speaks to him about it, he says, "Be of good cheer." We've seen how even evil events, such as a snare for his life, are being used by God to push Paul farther to where God wants him to be, to the point of Rome. And so even when evil men are acting evil all around us, the Lord is still at work. We see examples of that here in the life of Paul, because he's got a plan and a purpose to bring about, and he's got a plan and a purpose in your life, just like he did for Paul. And so next time, Wednesday night, we'll see what happens next.